Can LA build back from its most devastating wildfires? And is there a clear path forward for prevention? With some 16,000 buildings destroyed, the cost of recovery could break records. Who exactly will pay isn't entirely clear. But with California facing more climate-related disasters ahead, how should government be responding? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. Politicians and pundits are having a field day arguing over who's to blame for California's most devastating wildfires. But blame aside, a number of factors combine to create the perfect storm for disaster. From flammable homes and gardens to hurricane-force winds and a prolonged drought. The issue now is how to rebuild. The costs will be staggering, and many people are finding themselves uninsured. So who will actually pay and how? And if costs can't be covered, how far-reaching will the consequences of a local disaster really be? Here's a look.
It was an unprecedented inferno. 2 massive wildfires and 3 smaller ones that broke out on January the 7th decimated parts of northern Los Angeles. They destroyed more than 16,000 structures and killed 28 people. In total, 150,000 people were evacuated. Some of them will never return.
I feel broken, I feel lost, I feel devastated. I don't want to have to tell my boys that this was their home and it's gone. It's so tragic, and I know I'm not the only one, so I feel for everyone who's in this position, I really do.
Damages are estimated to be more than $250 billion. The federal government pledged to pay all disaster response costs and $770 in one-time payments to the victims. But that's small change. Many residents also had their insurance policies cancelled before the fires because the companies said they lived in high-risk areas. The region's largest insurer, State Farm, has dropped more than 3,600 policies in Los Angeles. Meanwhile, other residents have been offered astronomical renewal costs.
Insurance companies were not crediting consumers for having taken significant steps to protect their homes from wildfire. I spoke to a homeowner who basically rebuilt their home in concrete and still got canceled by their insurance company because of fire risk. So we need new protections in place to prevent insurance companies from abandoning consumers who do the right thing and harden their homes.
These issues have pushed many to the state's insurance program called FAIR. It's designed for those who can't find private insurance, but it is more expensive and has less coverage. Still, the number of FAIR policies has almost doubled in the last 3 years. And now there are concerns over whether the FAIR scheme has enough cash to meet insurance claims after the staggering cost of rebuilding.
We're going to make sure that the FAIR plan and those in it get the help that's guaranteed under that program. We'll do whatever's necessary. We're going to also have to address the broader insurance crisis that has forced people into the FAIR plan. This is something I've been working on for years over the opposition of the insurance industry. The insurance industry remains very profitable, but we can expect to see more major climate disasters, and we need to figure out the insurance piece along with everything else.
Meanwhile, the accelerating effects of climate change are making disasters more likely. Most of Southern California is experiencing severe or extreme drought, which sets the stage for more wildfires. President Trump has criticized the Democrat Governor Gavin Newsom for the lack of water and urged him to send supplies from the north to the south. Newsom has admitted that a shortage of water in the fire hydrants hampered the emergency response, but says the cause was a power issue, preventing the pumping of water from reservoirs to hydrants. While the ashes and rubble from the previous fires are still on the ground, on Wednesday a new blaze in Los Angeles put 54,000 residents under evacuation order. In the wake of what could be the costliest natural disaster in US history, California now faces the dual tasks of rebuilding and figuring out ways to stop further destruction.
Let's get some perspective now from someone who has spent years on the ground battling wildfires. And joining me from San Luis Obispo, California, the director of the Wildland-Urban Interface Fire Institute at California Polytechnic State and retired fire chief, Frank Frievalt. Frank, thanks so much for being with us. Help us understand really how monumental a job this is and has been for firefighters, especially in Los Angeles right now. Had they ever dealt with something on this scale before, and did they have the resources they needed?
Well, it's a great question. Well, certainly the speed and the duration of the last wind event, I think that started around January 7. They're used to those types of winds here in general. There are topographic features and the meteorological features that have Santa Ana winds here. But these were pretty extraordinary in terms of speed and gust. I personally, my personal worst, I think, was about 140 miles an hour. It was, we caught it on a data logger in a house that had burned down. So it's kind of how we verified it. But it wasn't just the speed, but, you know, this was preceded by a period of drought. There were very short distances between point of ignition and entry into the community. And so to have that much fire get into the community that quickly at that scale is pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, it must feel overwhelming. And I imagine some firefighters just must feel powerless when they see how quickly it can spread like this in a way that it hasn't before. So much is really being expected of firefighters at this stage, and it's expected to get even worse. So where does that leave the people that are on the front lines?
Well, it can be pretty humbling, you know, because a lot of times we do very well at wildland fire suppression. We've gotten very, very effective at it in some ways that can contribute. You know, we have, instead of a lot of low consequence, low intensity fires with the best of intentions of being very aggressive about suppressing fire, in some fuel types we've had a buildup of fuels that is unnatural. Other places we have the return interval for fire is far too frequent. So accumulation of fuels doesn't answer all of it, but it does contribute. And then the other big thing is really three things. You know, we have various social pressures, housing shortages, and so there is this increasing development in fire-dependent landscapes. These landscapes need to see fire at some kind of return interval. So as you put communities in those areas, that is going to happen as well. From a climate change standpoint, it's really, to me, the concept of vapor pressure deficit as the part of climate is most proximal to this, you know, to this issue.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about the social pressures and the lack of housing that, you know, ends up seeing people build in areas that they know are expected to burn. And then, you know, you will see those few houses that did build, somewhat costly sometimes, but in a fire preventive way so that they didn't burn down. But some are saying it's cost prohibitive. It's not fair to expect that from the entire community. But is it? I mean, basically tell us what changes you as a firefighter want to see so that you don't have to deal with this kind of devastation and loss of life even.
Excellent question and point. Last February, I took a small research team down to Chile, outside of Valparaiso. They had some devastating fires there. They're almost the exact opposite on the other side of the equator. It looks like a you know, a sister area. And you know, as we went through that situation, it's amazing how similar it is here. So when we're talking about this, you know, living in this fire-dependent landscape, we really actually need to adapt the way the houses are built, both new and retroactively harden the existing structures, because the conditions, you know, these are non-negotiable conditions. We can say it's too difficult, we can say it's too hard, but none of that changes the physics of what's happening. We're not going to stop all the ignitions. Most of the ignitions are human-caused. And so as you have this density of humans in fire-dependent landscapes with communities, we're not going to certainly suppress fires like this in these conditions. You're not going to stop all of the ignitions. And so you have to prepare the homes and the area immediately around the homes to accept fire embers, because those will arrive first. And you'll also get fire on the ground. And you can't just do it a little bit like COVID, right? If I'm the only one to get a vaccine, then we haven't achieved herd immunity. And so it's one thing to receive embers from a wildfire. It's another thing when you start getting structure to structure spread, where it's no longer a wildfire. It's an urban conflagration that, Europe in days of old, right, have faced. And so those types of mitigations have to be done at scale to prevent these kind of outcomes.
Okay, Frank Frievalt, we're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank you so much for being with us on the Newsmakers. Greatly appreciate it. So what can realistically be prevented? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Houston, founder of Climate Communications Collective and adjunct professor in climate communications at NYU, Nicole Loher. From Princeton, spokesperson for Climate Central, Peter Girard. And from Los Angeles, urbanist Joe McReynolds. Thanks all so much for being with me. Peter, I'll start with you. As for the causes, we're seeing some attacking really the local government for failing to invest in more reservoirs, for example, but there were a number of concerns, to be fair, about ecological damage earlier on, so it's not so simple to just say, oh, build more reservoirs, is it?
It is absolutely not so simple, particularly in an environment that's becoming hotter and drier. There simply isn't that much available water right now, and that is one of the underlying elements that you're seeing here.
Plus, you have a number of residents that kind of insist on having gardens that need to be watered rather than being, fire resistant. Often the indigenous vegetation that would be better suited. So is there an issue here with the people perhaps trying to have it kind of both ways?
Maybe. There is probably a bigger issue with people being unfamiliar with the kinds of risks that they are seeing in this environment. And that's largely because in many places, these risks are new. One of the outcomes of climate change is that the risk profiles in areas that people live in, and in this case, it's a risk of wildfire, are increasing. And it's really difficult to prepare for conditions you've never seen before. So it's absolutely true that there are steps that residents can take and communities can take to reduce their exposure to events like this, to wildfire risk. But in a lot of places, the danger is simply greater than it once was, and it's difficult for people to catch up.
Okay, Joe, let me ask if you would agree that it is difficult for people to prepare, or are there means? As I was speaking about with the fire chief earlier, we know that a few homes did survive because they were properly built for the environment. So is it a matter of people not being able to prepare, or the fact that it's perhaps too cost prohibitive? The government isn't enforcing certain regulations that would force them to build more fire retardant homes, to take out vegetation that burns more quickly. What do you think?
Well, certainly that's part of it. And you have to look not just at the homes themselves, but also at the environment around the homes. Do you have major corridors of very flammable vegetation leading between them? Do you have fire breaks? And this is something where a lot of cities that do frequently experience fires and were designed with that in mind will have buildings and boulevards specifically designed as fire breaks. And that's something that in the rebuild of the Palisades may come up. But there's also the important insurance angle of preparation here, where for a very long time, California simply decided to wish away through regulation the realistically rising risks of major fires, causing insurers to exit the market because they were not allowed to raise their rates in tandem with the rising risks that they foresaw, which then created a use of insurers of last resort provided by the state, which now the state budget is on the hook for. So there's definitely a lot of preparation that needs to go into preventing this happening in the future. And also, as I hope we'll talk about on this panel, in providing enough housing so that when disasters do happen, in a state like California, the housing market is resilient to it, because those who lost their homes are now facing the second crunch of California's dramatically scarce housing market, where nearly all housing has been prohibited from building, and what little is built is usually studios, one bedrooms, not
practical for families, that's for sure. Okay, let me get to Nicole then, because Joe had brought up the insurance issue. And if we talk about how Californians can rebuild, we know a number of insurers actually stopped taking on any new business covering wildfires over the last couple of years. So first tell us, how many people will actually be able to afford rebuilding, and do insurers have the right to do that? Because not only is it cost prohibitive for them, reinsurers are raising their prices as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. We're really looking at a question is the uninsured or underinsured going to be covered in this situation, because so many people have been affected. And, President Biden approved the major disaster declaration, which essentially enables FEMA to provide financial aid to those impacted. But, we're only really looking at $20,000 a head. And that's not very much when you consider the average cost of the house in the Pacific Palisades is roughly $3 to $4 million. And this entire wildfire season right now is accumulating a $250 billion tab. It is legal for these insurance companies to do this. There's a lot of regulations here at play, and we're seeing them actually come to light as the days roll on. But I think the bigger question comes around human migration and where these individuals will land after the dust settles.
Okay, so how does it work then, Nicole? Because you know insurance best. What's supposed to happen to the people that aren't covered? And I remember before, we used to see, in the case of what they would call natural disasters, FEMA could kind of step in. And there had been controversy about federal taxpayer money going to some very wealthy people to rebuild some very large, excessive homes, but the homeowners qualified just the same. Are we going to see that again in this case? Will federal funding be able to cover some of the gaps?
We're not thinking so. And I think the California FAIR Plan was actually mentioned a little bit earlier in the segment, and they're even facing some issues right now with funding. So if we're just taking a step back, the actual issue that we're seeing is that as you had mentioned, the insurance companies are revoking coverage from more and more places that they deem too high of risk. So meaning that pooled premium will not actually cover that anticipated risk area. So as a result, we're seeing those massive gaps in coverage, meaning those vulnerable homeowners are left with few or no affordable options for insurance, which is kind of where we're at now. And folks are going to have to leave their areas and rebuild. It's why we're seeing a surplus of GoFundMes in the market, where people are having to pool their own funds to recreate their lives. And, as I mentioned a little bit, but as we progress further into this unmanaged warming world, we're going to see more human migration away from those risky areas. But it also makes you question back to the insurance part of this, where will insurance continue to cover in 20 to 30 years from now? And, the issue is that insurers are not being very forthcoming about that.
Yeah, is one last question for you, Nicole. Is any of this sustainable, given the size of disasters now, and that there are more and more increasing populations in urban centers, so that these natural disasters, the cost is unscalable now? Is insurance sustainable?
It is if there's changes to the market. So short term, insurance can offer premium discounts to customers who are investing in home frameworks, like we discussed earlier, that are really conforming to these wildfires and the upcoming weather disasters. They're not, a surprise. We know that they're coming, especially with the California wildfires. We knew that it was a conversation of when and not if.
Okay, so yeah. Let me turn to Peter quickly, though, because, we also have this issue of some people kind of being in denial about the real risks. And people have asked if the public will finally wake up, or instead, because of the federal government in power that doesn't really feel climate change is an issue, they'll decide instead that nothing needs to change. Because, again, climate change isn't really causing this, so you just have to go on with life as usual.
The truth is, it's really hard for people who've been affected by an event like this not to think about a change in climate and not to think about risks. So in some ways, it's a really unfortunate way for people to recognize that the world around them is changing, but we do frequently see that when you see a disaster, when you see a major fire like this. And it's really undeniable. People who've lived in these areas for years see changes around them. They see the outgrowth of those risks increasing. They see hotter and drier and windy conditions happening more and more often, and people who are attuned to fire risk understand that that increases the risks of wildfires spreading and putting them in jeopardy. And as risks increase, as the climate continues to warm, as these high-risk days continue to proliferate, places that didn't see really acute levels of risk will experience more and more. So the danger will actually come into new areas in pronounced ways that will, I think, force people to understand and respond to change.
Right. Joe, I mean, since you have a lot of confidence in responsible urban planning to kind of help prevent disasters, I mean, tell us how many solutions you think we can engineer when facing a changing climate and ever bigger natural disasters.
Well, I think fundamentally you definitely see an adaptation in building codes over time. And I think it's worth remembering, even as we do see an increase in natural disasters, now we're coming from a recent past, 50, 100 years ago, where cities were much less resilient than they are now. So we've made a lot of hard-won gains over time, and I don't think that a rise in natural disasters ultimately makes our cities unsustainable, but it does mean that our cities fundamentally need to adapt to a changing climate. And that's something where not only building standards, but things like neighborhood design, urban design, and frankly, shifting the balance on public policy. In California, there's been just a real stasis of public policy around disaster relief, around housing construction, around nearly everything to do with our urban environment. And I think this is really a wake-up call that public policy needs to get unstuck.
Okay, give me an example then. What should good government be doing right now? Tell me a policy.
Good government should be rebuilding the Palisades very differently than how it looked before. So there's been a lot of talk about how we're going to expedite rebuilding in the Palisades. You've heard that from Governor Newsom. You've heard that from the mayor of LA. But that is a very narrow expediting, where it's only if you are rebuilding things more or less as they were before. And so the actual right to rebuild in smarter, better ways, dense mixed-use urbanism that is fire resistant and that is designed around, frankly, more people being able to live in the Palisades as well, to ease those sort of housing shortages that are more acute when you have a more disaster-prone region. All of that.
Do you think people will accept, especially those who think they've earned this kind of, I guess, elite lifestyle in the Palisades? These are millionaires, to say the least, living up in these hills. Do you think they're willing to accept that it's not going to be the same and they're going to have to share space in a different way? Will people be prepared for that?
Will they accept it is an open question. But can they be made to accept it? I believe yes. I think this is a critical moment in urban policy in California. Folks in Sacramento like Scott Wiener really pushing the envelope on getting California to look towards the future in urban policy. And so I do think that things might not just continue business as usual after this crisis.
Okay.
I'm an optimist. Fingers crossed.
Definitely fingers crossed. And, Nicole, there's the question of these cities now being sustainable, and we're talking about fires in this case, but there's also issues of massive earthquakes that are looking at hitting California. I mean, again, is it insurance that's going to have to be expected to protect people and to fund rebuilding when these types of major disasters are challenging homeowners and residents in huge swathes of the state.
I mean, we're getting into, I think, a moral debate here of, is what this business is offering, yielding the results that people are expecting. You have some people on the side of the fence that say I'm on the side of the fence that's saying that, they should be adjusting to the market. Otherwise, they're not fulfilling their duty. And then you have other folks like the insurance companies who are saying that they'll go bankrupt if they are, adhering to every disaster. So I think it really is more or less a moral debate. But, if you're an individual in these situations, California is a very tough landscape. You just have to be very proactive about finding the insurance that works for you.
Right. But the thing is as well, it's not just about California. When these costs are put on these insurance companies as well, prices go up across the country. People in Oklahoma can feel what's happening in California. Is that fair?
Yes. I would not say it's fair. No. I think that the entire insurance industry needs to be reworked, but that is going to take time. And the best way that people can do that is for advocating through that with their local representatives.
Okay. Well, that will have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of you sincerely so much for being with me. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.